Here's a question. When a film gets banned, how long is that ban supposed to stay in effect? I guess ideally the answer is forever, but historically that has basically never been the case. The best you can possibly hope for is, at some point, the film just stops existing. Which does happen occasionally. So today we're going to look at 7 films that have been banned from existing. Well, that's hyperbolic. Some of these films actually have been found. It's 7 films that, at one time or another, were considered lost, due at least in part to being banned. Convention City. Convention City was made and released in 1933 and was considered incredibly controversial upon release. It's described as a lewd comedy. It featured a number of sexual jokes and provocative outfits, possibly even full frontal nudity. Studio head Jack Warner clashed with the crew of the film, demanding less revealing outfits and cuts to lines of dialogue, most of which were ignored. Many theater owners refused to screen the film, and several prints were destroyed under the pretense that they promoted bad morals and anti-Christian sentiment. In 1934, just 1 year after the film's release, the Hays Code was inactive, effectively banning the film, and it was pulled from theaters at the end of its 1933 run. In 1936, Warner Brothers attempted to get a censored version passed, but the MPAA considered it beyond redemption. So in 1948, Warner Brothers dumped the film, destroying every known copy of it. Now, it wasn't uncommon for studios to dump copies of older films back in the day, but theaters were keen to hold on to them. But with Warner pulling the film from circulation, they had nearly every copy. There are rumors that prints still exist, and I'd say it's even very likely they do, but there haven't been any rumors of it resurfacing since 1999. Plenty remains of it, though, as we have production stills and a screenplay. Also, exterior shots of Atlantic City filmed for this movie were used as stock footage in other Warner Brothers productions. As for Convention City, it's unlikely we'll ever see it again, though I think there may be a chance. Birth Control. Birth Control is a documentary on the controversial Margaret Sanger, a writer, nurse, and advocate of birth control and sexual education. Margaret Sanger can be a little complicated to talk about. She did do a lot of good work in the field of birth control and Planned Parenthood. She's gained the ire of the anti-abortion crowd despite openly being against abortion. They'd like to mischaracterize her as some racist person bent on wiping out the black race, which is not true. She was very close with many black community leaders. But in the 20s and 30s, she did kind of align herself with eugenicists. Not along racial lines, but still, that's not good. Later in her career, she kind of stepped away from that and became anti-natalist, but none of that's really important to this film. In 1917, she would write, direct, and produce her own film explaining her ideas and documenting her work. Although it was initially passed by the National Board of Review, it ran into trouble in most cities it's shown in and was eventually pulled entirely, based on the Supreme Court rulings in Mutual Film Corp. Versus Industrial Commission of Ohio, stating film exhibitions do not constitute free speech. That's probably worth taking a look at someday. We'll get to it. Anyways, it's unclear how the film went missing, but given how many films in the early days of cinema are lost, and how this film barely ran anywhere, it's easy to guess every copy was lost or destroyed. Strangely, there's very little information on the film, and there barely seems to be record of it outside of the fact that it was banned. Not even a lead on how a copy might be found. It's wild that this is one of the most effective bans on a film ever. It literally hasn't been seen in over a century. And over a science-based documentary. Sure is crazy that some people don't care about facts when it comes to things like sex education. Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft, anyone? Moving on. A Son of Satan. And dozens, if not hundreds, more black cinema films from the 1920s. If you learn one thing today, it's that film preservation was not good until around the invention of TV, when films could finally be shown outside cinemas. But that goes double for early black cinema. Hollywood wasn't really interested in making films by or for black people. I mean, they didn't have much money and couldn't get into most segregated theaters, so what's the point? So black filmmakers were on their own, creating a genre of race films, almost all of which are lost. Like, we didn't even care about the mainstream stuff. Of course this wasn't getting preserved. Out of 500 plus race films made, fewer than 100 still survive. Now, I'm confident A Son of Satan was not the only race film to get banned, but it's certainly the most widely known. A Son of Satan was a film from director Oscar Micheaux, directed in 1924. There's very little to go off of as far as story. We don't even know if it's literally about Satan or if that's just a catchy title. We know it was banned for violence, in particular violence against women, a cat, and the murder of a member of the Ku Klux Klan. It also contained scary mixed-race couples, and in a couple states, got banned just for the title. It's not a surprise that this film has been lost, and in fact, its banning might have helped it become one of the better-known lost race films. After all, if it got legally banned, there is still record of it. There's probably plenty of these movies that there's just no record of. Gone forever. So, A Son of Satan can rest easy knowing at least its banning is something to be remembered by. Okay, we got risque humor, sex education, and black people. What else do these guys really hate? Oh, I know. Gay people. Children of Loneliness. Children of Loneliness is one of those 1930s films that straddled the line between pretending to be informative and actually being exploitation, Haxan, Reefer Madness, you know the type. This film discussed homosexuals, the third sex. Woohoo! Non-binary people would blow these fuckers' minds. The film revolves around two college students, Bobby, a lesbian interested in her roommate, and a homosexual man whose name has not survived, being pursued by a woman. By the end of the movie, the man has committed suicide because he could never have a normal marriage, which, yeah, there's significant evidence that making gay marriage illegal puts gay men at risk of suicide. Much more mean-spiritedly, however, Bobby throws acid at the girl she likes, which somehow ends up back in her own face, causing her to go blind, run out into the middle of the street, and get hit by a car. I am unable to parse from the available information how pro or anti-gay this movie was. Obviously, it was very ill-informed regarding gay identity, but it could have been sympathetic. After all, it was loosely based on the novel Well of Loneliness, which is a pro-lesbian book. On the other hand, after showings of the film, people claiming to be doctors would frequently hand out pamphlets on how to cure homosexuality. It's unclear if these doctors were attached to the production of the film or protesters trying to dissuade people from sympathizing with the gays. My guess is the former. This film was almost certainly anti-gay, but who knows. Of course, being pro-gay would help get this film banned a lot faster. Not that being anti-gay would save it. Moral panic groups are odd in how even a negative depiction of something they don't like is bad. Reefer Madness got banned for daring to depict marijuana even in a bad and inaccurate light. Whichever way it happened, Children of Loneliness was banned in a few states, and after its initial run, it hasn't been seen in any form since. It's possible it's still out there somewhere. I mean, there's not even record of it being destroyed. Maybe someone's sitting on it, unwilling to release it due to the sensitive subject matter. But I think just as likely it's gone forever. But I can do better than this. Check it. Different from the others. Hey, guess what? We are talking about the Institute für Sexualwissenschaft. The Institute was a German organization dedicated to scientific research into sex and sexuality. And in 1933, the Nazis took over and destroyed most of their writings, setting research into queer identity back decades. But before that, they created a film in 1919 called Different from the Others, the first ever film with a positive depiction of a gay person. Hell, probably the first film with any depiction of a gay person. You might remember last year I talked briefly about Victim from 1961. Well, Victim is largely a remake of Different from the Others. The film follows a violin teacher who falls for one of his students. This is discovered by a con artist who takes to blackmailing the teacher. Throughout the film, Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft founder Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld appears as himself, explaining queer concepts such as homosexuality, gender identity, and intersex people to the characters, and by extension the audience. Of course that didn't fly in 1919. It would probably catch flack today. It was banned in many countries before ultimately being destroyed by the Nazis in the aforementioned destruction of everything for the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft. Luckily, some of this movie exists. 50 minutes of it, in fact. Enough of the plot is retained in what remains that it's thought this might be the full film. Still, the original opening credits are missing, and it's unknown how long the original film was. So we've got some, but presumably not all of the original. Which is great, all things considered. We're really lucky to have such an important piece of queer cinema history still around, even if it's not the full film. Alright, enough of that. Let's do a fun one. Cards of Death. Filmed in 1985 in California, Cards of Death is an extremely violent, shot-on-video slasher movie. Despite being American in origin, it was only ever released in Japan on VHS, where it was allegedly banned. I will admit, I couldn't find a good source on it being banned. That might have just been a rumor based on the limited quantities of the film. But this is one of my favorite pieces of lost media, and if I didn't include it, this list would be all old silent movies. Anyway, there was only a limited run on the VHS, making it extremely rare and sought after among collectors. I tend to consider lost media to be a bit spooky, and clearly I'm not alone in this thought. And Cards of Death is a perfect example of why. A movie so violent, only a few copies got made, so you either have to know someone or put a lot of money up to get your hands on it. What maddening images could be in this film to keep it out of the hands of the public. Unfortunately, this one has a somewhat anticlimactic ending. The film did see a brief re-release through Bleeding Skull Video, after which it was ripped and uploaded online. I was gonna end this with something spooky like, "You can watch it if you know where to find it," before linking to the Lost Media Wiki where there's a direct link to it. But between doing research for this video and actually writing it, the rights to the film were bought out by the American Genre Film Archive, who do really good releases of obscure and homemade exploitation films, with apparent plans to release the film on Blu-ray. Google also seems to think this film is available on Shudder, but I have Shudder and that is not the case. Still, for a movie with a creepy story behind it, Cards of Death is one that can send a shiver down your spine, even if nowadays it's just a normal movie. And finally, Victory of Faith. Jumping back to the Nazis, here's a film that was Nazi propaganda that was later banned by the Nazis. Yeah, allow me to explain. Victory of Faith was supposed to be the Nazis' big dramatic propaganda piece, but it prominently featured Ernst Röhm and several other high-ranking German officials the Nazis would go on to kill in the Night of Long Knives, rendering the film basically useless. Also, Victory of Faith came to be rather incidentally. It was mostly a documentation of a party rally held in Nuremberg, and came out rather small in scope, at least compared to the film that replaced it, Triumph der Willens, or Triumph of the Will. Now, I did a project on Triumph of the Will in college, and its production, all the ways it's incredibly deceptive. It's a very fascinating topic to me. I could probably talk for a very long time about it, but instead I will just link you to an informative video about it and say, as of right now, you are at least tangentially familiar with Triumph of the Will. If you have seen any footage of Nazis, any type of Nazi propaganda, or even just cinema based on Nazi propaganda, it was based on Triumph of the Will. Probably any footage you have seen has come from Triumph of the Will. It is the piece of Nazi propaganda. And in order for it to exist, Victory of Faith had to stop existing. So after the production of Triumph of the Will, all copies of Victory of Faith were ordered to be destroyed. Triumph of the Will was the one and only documentation of the Nazi Party. And this was actually considered to be lost for some time until a full version was discovered in 1980. One single print of this movie remains. I think the whole Triumph of the Will debacle is a fascinating look into the minds of totalitarian propagandists. We can't just ban films that make us look bad. We have to ban films that make us look not good enough. And that's where we'll end it. 7 times a ban helped create a lost movie. Of course, one time a movie got lost in order to make a movie that got banned. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. Until then, I'm Matt, and happy Banned Films Week.